Psychotechnologies Live! Welcome to a very special episode of Psychotechnologies Live. This episode, we have Layman Pascal, who is a meta-developmental cognitive theorist, something like that, which is pretty crazy. We're going to find out a little bit more about that. And in preparation for this meeting, I actually watched some of his videos with John Vervaeke and Peter Limberg on the Stoa. So he's a very famous guy, been interviewed with other famous guys. He's part of networks and stuff and other interesting things that we're going to find out this episode. So, Layman, what is metacognitive developmental theory stuff?
Great question, Daniel.
And did I just make this up right now, or is this a real thing?
I just, what I realized when you asked that question, you could rearrange the parts of that statement in any order, and it would basically mean the same thing.
Yeah, those are my favorite words.
Meta, developmental. I mean, there's a loose conglomeration of overlapping communities and a loose conglomeration of overlapping theoretical models and zones of practice. So all the people in these zones, when they try to describe it theoretically, they're all talking about how to bring multiple perspectives together in a way that embraces both general evolutionary theory and the possibilities of human development up to human maturity and beyond into some more advanced states that we might call construct aware, we might call integral, we might call metacognitive. And metacognitive is a term that blurs the line between developmental psychology and spiritual practice, because it's a lot of the same stuff involved in witnessing yourself and performing operations on your own psyche and the subcomponents of your psychology in order to get a more generally integrated and interesting kind of interior life.
I think I want to start with
that was a lot.
a very specific, I'm going to call it a Christmas complaint because it's like we're around Christmas time right now. So according to the Jesus story, he died at about 30, right? And this is like a bone I have to pick with Christianity. No one knows how to be like in Wizarding World, you become old and gray and you become an 80-year-old and you do magical power things, right? But in Christian world, there isn't like how to become the Messiah, but be like 50 or 60 or 70. And like, what do you do with the lacking model? I mean, I see a lot of Christmas decorations. How do you scaffold maturity in a tradition that doesn't have an old Messiah?
Well, there are a lot of sages in Christianity, but Jesus is not really a sage character. He's an avatar character. He's the, spontaneous emergence of the human divine in a transcendental sense, typically, if we take any of it seriously, because most of it's kind of bullshit. But the figure of Jesus, I kind of view it from the Kierkegaardian sense. It's kind of like a koan. It's a mind-breaking entity. It's a historical human divine paradox. So I don't look to something like Jesus, and I would not assume that most Christians really look to a Jesus as a kind of wisdom character. He's a transcendental character. It's a little bit different. Although you could find, wise old Gnostic sages, various saints, Meister Eckhart. Like, Christianity is full of developmentally wise characters with various psychotechnologies, but Jesus, not exactly. It's more of a symbolic affirmation of the paradox of ultimate being.
Okay. So
your language is, I think, more advanced than our language since.
Okay. So I'll drink some more.
Yeah, I kind of just want to go back and break down all the different ideas and into like more colloquial, or like something that's like better, easier for people to understand. So pick a thing and start there, because I don't remember them all.
Is this like you want to move out of academic into like everyday?
Yeah, a little more everyday if we can do that, or at least maybe
zero in on
dialogos between the academic
until we find a way to say it that we like.
Yeah, so I guess let's start at the beginning. So you said it's like there's a lot of so there's the space here. There's a lot of stuff, a lot of people in the space doing a lot of various things. I think like we have that perspective as well, where it's like psychotechnology is really cool and I can't just pick one, so I want to do them all. And so we're just psychotechnologists, and that's just what we do. You're talking evolution. You started with evolution, so humans evolve, so you're within like this kind of Darwinian paradigm, I guess. And then also you talked about Jesus as the transcendental figure. I don't know if that's something that you practice, like Jesus transcendence.
Not really. You know, I'm Christian in the sense that we're all Christians. Like a post-Christian culture is still a kind of a Christian culture. There was a Bible in my house when I was a kid, so I'm Christian in that sense. I appreciate the various permutations that it's had in the history of the culture. Sorry, I'm using words that are too big. I don't really, it doesn't play a big part for me. I lived in a Buddhist community for a long time, and I wanted to make sure I wasn't getting top heavy into the Buddhism. So I would go to a different Christian church every week, just because that's what was around. So I've been to a lot of them, but I don't regard them as particularly privileged or important, certainly not in my own personal experience. But I do think and do practice with the notion of like embodied transcendence and figures that are paradoxical, that kind of break your mind. And I think Jesus is interesting in the sense that one way to use him is to think of him as a koan, as a Zen puzzle that breaks your mind, because he can't, all the things they say about him can't logically fit together. You can't be God and a man, mortal and immortal, transcendental and destroyed, immortal and dead, historical and transhistoric, right? It's too many things. So if you're gonna work with Jesus, you're working with a puzzle, a transrational puzzle, something goes beyond ordinary thinking.
I want to look at that from like a psychotech lens. Like, why is it that this character got overloaded with all of this stuff? What does it do to a human brain when we're like overload this concept? Why is that in the tradition to overload? I mean, it's not the only tradition that does this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the way in integral thinking, there's this thing called the pre-trans fallacy, right? So there's a lower level overload and there's a higher level overload. The lower level overload is a lot of our ancestors and a lot of people today don't tease things apart very well, right? You can think of a time when there was one book called the book, and every culture kind of had a Bible, and that was your sci-fi, it was your erotica, it was your psychotechnologies, it was your history, it was your law code, it was everything shoved in one book. And so now we look back and we're like, that's too much. That's too much for one book, man. You're going to get a fucked up society if you try to overload everything too much. So modern civilization teases that stuff apart. Separation of church and state, separation of science and poetry. They've got to have their own space to move in. So there's a primitive overload, which is common to mythic, pre-rational belief systems. But there's also a post-rational, trans-rational overload, where we take the forms we're given, and because we have an instinct in us to try to transcend ourselves, we pervert our history. We pervert the things that we see in order to make them be something that our minds can't grasp, so that we can be in a relationship to something that goes beyond our understanding. And that relationship is kind of like an engine that helps us keep moving forward beyond our current limits.
Dude, I do that all the time. I try not to do that anymore, but it's hard. Yeah. So like, just to like do it, like to say that like the difference is, one is where you have everything in one place, and like that's sort of like, to understand the Bible in its entirety is too much. And then the other way is to take a mundane thing that is to its own place and to blow it up beyond what it is, and to say this is transcendent, this is where everything exists as.
Yeah, it's not too different in a way than if you read like H.P. Lovecraft and the monster is indescribably horrible, or you watch a David Lynch movie and he's showing you like a light bulb and he's just zooming in and there's this awful noise. There's too much. He's showing you that there's too much in a form, and then you can have a relationship to that too muchness. Now, some people will argue that this is a great spiritual historical kind of argument. Is the too muchness inherent in reality? or are we projecting the too muchness onto things, right? You kind of do the same practices in either case, but there's a metaphysical argument about, are we discovering it or creating it?
I would say that we're not very skilled at self-regulating how much we're getting. So sometimes there's just, it's like opening the fire hose, and sometimes it's like closing it down. And some people don't have control over that at all, and other people are still learning control, and we're all kind of a bit shell-shocked by the possibility that there's too much.
Yeah.
You know what, flash for me, sorry to interrupt you, is what we were just discussing is a little bit like the difference between I don't know, like a fetish and a peak experience. Like both of them are, you're like, oh my God, just women in high heels or something like that, right? It's too much, but it's a primitive too much. It's automatic, it's built in, you're not responsible for it. It probably leads you down a lot of wrong pathways, but it's super salient. Like it's a very vivid kind of experience. On the other hand, a peak experience is a kind of liberating or expansive overload of your thinking and perception. And there may be ways to engineer that by creating super connectedness between parts of our psyche.
Tell us more about how to engineer these kind of psychotechnologies.
Well, I talk a lot about this thing I call the integration surplus model, and might actually have been John Vervaeke who called it that the first time I had a conversation with him. But anyway, we have all these different parts, right? We normally think of ourselves as just ourselves, but as soon as you delve into yourself, you're like, oh, I have a left and a right brain. I have a conscious and unconscious. Maybe I've got chakras. Maybe I've got a masculine and feminine. There's a lot of different voices inside here. The very traditional way is just to talk about heart, mind, and body as kind of like three different intelligences in us. And so there are some traditional psychotechnologies that involve just trying to recognize and balance those systems. So let's say you were either in like physical activity or we're sitting down to meditate or something like that. You could find those three systems, find what your heart's doing, what your mind's doing, what your body's doing, get a good sense of the three of them, and try to have them be equally present in your awareness. And then they're kind of touching each other and they're balanced, and it puts you in a really good position to have them sort of grow together into a sudden moment of experience that exceeds your ability to process it. And you get like a generalized beingness or some other kind of excessive moment of harmonized coherence that goes beyond your normal understanding. So that's one approach to hacking the peak experience stuff from the internal practice side rather than say the psychedelic side.
Yeah, that's a really like that. I really like that. Like that's like it's like a broad recipe almost for having, I guess, these, you're calling them peak experience. Yeah, it's like a broad recipe for having peak experiences. So you're saying these are the elements and they need to be all imbalanced and awareness, and then you're going to have peak experience. And then there's probably a bunch of different ways of doing that in practice.
Yeah, like whatever parts you have, like there's different ways to analyze yourself into parts, right? You could be like, well, there's the part of me that's aware of myself and the part of me that's aware of all my perceptions, right? And inside and outside. Well, maybe I could simultaneously track those and try to hold them in balance next to each other for a while, and then get some kind of peak explosion out of that, right? And there's a lot of Hindu style meditation practices that work that way, where you're going to be aware of the seer and the seen simultaneously until you engineer a moment in which it seems like they are inherently the same thing in a way that overloads you pleasantly.
And that's really nice. Like, so you're like kind of splitting the self in a bunch of ways, and then saying, okay, now you're split in half like this. Now match these two in intensity. Yeah. It's reminding me very much of Naruto. I'm watching Naruto now, and you're like mixing the chakras together into like the right blend.
Yeah, which is, I mean, it's just like what we do in music with harmonics. We do it in physics with harmonics. So it seems like a very natural way to think about this stuff in a way that's it's sort of not metaphysically captured.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is very like grounded. I guess I don't know how to describe this, but it's like a very grounded, transcendental peak experience generator. And then I guess
no
what you
nonsense approach. Like you don't have to believe in a thing or pull in a deity or work really hard at it for like days and days and days. You can just like from the ground perceive this, and like balance them out.
Yeah. And I guess you can take people and you can say, like, how do you see the world? And then they say a bunch of stuff and you're like, okay, well, like, let's do those things. And we'll take those things that you're already willing to encounter and to exist within. And then we're going to give you a peak experience from that. That's really clever.
It's a kind of thinking that could be used. Like, I think you can probably go to most historical inner practices and see how they're a version of the same process, and find one that works with any particular belief system or cultural context or stage of development, and then move everybody forward. And the ways, this is kind of an integral thing, right? The ways in which we encounter that extra, the overtone, the peak, the numinous surplus we produce, that'll be lensed to us. We'll experience it differently depending on the angle we're coming in. Maybe we experience it as a super self or a super other being or just a greater energy or sensation. And then that in turn we interpret based on our our cultural and mental capacity, right? If I'm totally in a Christian universe, maybe I see that as the Lord. If I'm totally in a Hindu universe, maybe it's Krishna or Vishnu. If I'm in an atheist universe, maybe it's just an energy of some kind that I run into. So it's dependent upon my complexity of development and the cultural context in which I'm embedded.
Right. Like that's how you'd be labeling and describing.
Yeah. You would. So the same mechanism would be interpreted differently, but you could say, yeah, they're roughly doing all the same thing and we can help them do it better no matter how they want to phrase it.
I want to ask, like,
that's really genius.
Where is your ground? Like you said, it depends on our social cultural framework as to how we're interpreting reality, as to how it shows up. I also have a sense that there is still a ground. There is still one that like habitual. I happen to look through this one more often than the other ones. Which one's your ground? Or is it completely up for grabs after a while, after a bunch of personal development work, after...
I mean, I moved through a lot of them, but I could probably identify some favorites or ones that I associate more with my own personal history. I tend to deal with things on a very visceral, somatic level. I've always been good at, or even intentionally practiced, sort of somatic interoception, sensing the whole inside of the body like it's an energy. So that's usually where I go to. And once in a while, then I experience it as a devotional relationship to an other. Probably more often than that, I experience it as if it is a stimulation of my subconscious intelligence. I'm very interested in my leanings towards shamanism because I come out of a pretty naturalistic background. Also suggests to me that the subconscious should be thought of very much as the centerpiece of all this. Like if you go to integral theory or spiral dynamics or any one of the half dozen really good developmental models, one of the things they do that's problematic is they talk a little bit like who you are in the front of your mind when you're awake and can talk, that's basically who you are, and that's the person who grows through these different stages. There's some truth to that, but most of our brain is unconscious. Most of our history is unconscious. And so what we'd really want to do is cause development to occur to our subconscious intelligence, right? What I really want is my subconscious to be smarter and more spiritual than I am. I could be a good assistant, but I'm never going to be in command of all of these functions. I could be the priest in the temple, but I'm not the god. So ways, and I think shamanism is one of those ways where you can sort of spiritualize the non-conscious and even non-linear kinds of intelligences that are inside us. I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, I mean, you gave me some pointers as like which ones are like I have this experience more recently. Someone gave me this maybe a lens that your external reality is a representation of your subconscious. And that is like if you're in your office and it's a messy office, that's a representation. If you're in a social group and you're seeing the qualities of certain people show up, that's a representation of your subconscious. So starting to work with the external realm as if it is a mirror of the internal. And that's just like, occasionally it flashes at me. I'm like, oh, really? This is what my subconscious is looking like today. Like, how interesting.
That's a great example of one of the ways that you could be simultaneously tracking and super coordinating different aspects of yourself, right? The part of you that's seeing the world and the part of you that believes it has a whole bunch of subconscious motives that are organizing things. When you're working with both of those, you can get these little hits.
Right.
Yeah, and if you're going to do both of them together, then you're going to get the transcendental experience.
It certainly increases your odds of having those breakthroughs.
Mm.
This is really genius. Did you come up with this one, or did you find this?
Both. You know, I've been working on it in my own style for a long time, but everything I know I took from somebody and put it together.
How long do you think?
This is like so simple. It's such a simple formula for generating so much stuff. I'm like in awe of it. Sorry.
Well, the specific phrasing of it goes back maybe 10 years. So I spent a lot of time, and still do, involved in the Gurdjieff tradition. Not so much anymore the actual people who are doing it, but definitely the works that he left and bequeathed to us. So that's an approach that, to my way of seeing it, has the basis of an integration surplus model in it. That's how I would describe it. But then when I come through the integral community, I go, oh, there's a much bigger map of parts. He's using a very simple map of parts. We've got this elaborate map. There must be all different ways that you could do that same thing with this bigger map. And then if that's the case, can I find it in other traditions as well, and like retro engineer the functionality of internal techniques? So in terms of doing that deliberately and having a name for it, yeah, about 10 years. But if I wanted to go back further, I'd be like, well, it's just my essence. It's my destiny. All along.
I mean, I kind of just want to ask, like, when did you become a wizard? You know, like, were you born a wizard, or did you have a teenager thing and then you were like, oh, I am a wizard? You know, the letter came in the mail and the Harry, you're a wizard, or...
I had so many books about wizards when I was a little kid. Seemed like the obvious move. I remember we moved down. I lived really rurally, and we moved down to what seemed to me the big city, which was a tiny city. And I went to this school, and the first thing we did at this bigger school was have a Renaissance fair, and you had to pick your character. For some reason, I picked Paracelsus, the alchemist. Right? So like, that's pretty early on. I didn't even realize what I was doing, but I always thought, yeah, alchemist, that sounds about right.
Yeah, I want to come back to the psychotech. like this one is just, it's because like I've been looking for an easy way to generate psychotechs, and like this seems like pretty straightforward. Like you could just sit for a day and like brainstorm, and then you'd come up with a bunch of them. Can we just like walk through it? Is that cool?
Whatever you want.
Okay. Okay, so it started. Okay, so who's this guy it started with? I haven't heard of him.
Gurdjieff, Russian mystic. Yeah. Gurdjieff was a Russian mystic. He has a massive tradition. He's the teacher of like I tend to say Chongrang Trungpa is the teacher of everyone. I'm also starting to find Gurdjieff is also the teacher of everyone.
Like, Trungpa used a couple of Gurdjieffian phrases like idiot compassion and things like that. It's a little bit sort of on the down low, like they don't advertise too much, the Gurdjieffians.
Weird.
There's a lot of different variations that descended from that, but really interesting, strange guy. Sometimes, like, if you imagine a cross between like Borat, Indiana Jones, and the Buddha.
He like sold carpets.
I am kind of liking this guy now. I don't even know it.
Yeah, his books are bizarre and hard to read, like science fiction, avant-garde 20s novels kind of stuff. But his insights are fantastic, and the people who knew him, who were pretty high caliber people, were impressed as hell just by being around this guy. So it's pretty good. It's impressive.
Okay. And like this is kind of, I guess, is like one trick to maximizing your psychotech is to split the world in half and then put them back together.
Yeah. Yeah, he was more like the way I described it initially, like the simplified form of heart, mind, and body. That's the way that it's presented in the Gurdjieff tradition. But obviously, if you have different kinds of breakdowns of our internal system, you can do roughly the same thing with all these other components,
I mean, you
Right.
can do
as
the
we see
10
people
Sephirot
do.
if you want. You can do the 10 Sephirot and like divide into 10 and then like look at them talking to each other.
Yeah, or you see like where does spirituality pop up in the arts, for example? Like Nijinsky, ballet dancer, had this period of time where he felt like he was turning into God when he was on stage. You think, oh, is that because he was really overdriving his body, but overdriving his emotions at the same time, like trying to super inhabit his body emotionally? Or you read Nietzsche, who I'm a big fan of. Is he bringing aesthetic and cognitive intelligence together to the point that they create something more than the sum of their parts? And is that why there's this sort of dancing, self-deifying tone to the last couple of books? So there's a lot of different ways to go at
Because
this.
I do sometimes feel like God when I'm doing stuff, and it's like confusing because sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. And I guess that is like the parts interacting or interlocking. That's so
I
interesting.
don't know if I want to feel like God. I think like we have this God model, right? God is the seer of everything, the worker harder at everything, the sort everything out for me thing. And then we've got the us, the boring little entity that receives godly experience, wisdom, kindness, compassion, all the rest. Like I've been working on the skill of becoming more human and less God and more like the small one who receives. And that's been pretty exciting too.
Yeah, different kinds of ways to think about God, right? One way is to think about God as the alternative to the world. And there's something implicitly nihilistic in that, in a way, right? It's always like the best thing doesn't exist in reality, it's somewhere else. And it makes a mockery of humanity and life and matter and mortality and finitude and all that shit, right?
Yeah.
Nietzsche said heaven was a way to slander the earth. So there is that kind of
That's
element
contrast,
of,
right?
I
you
do
don't
feel
really
like
want
people
that
do
kind
that,
of God.
yeah.
And our ancestors would make these, like our patriarchal asshole ancestors to some degree would make these charts where at the bottom is like minerals, then like cats and dogs and women and men. And then it goes up and it gets up to like angels and then God, and like it's more and more impersonal, abstract. And then you surrender even the concept of God and you're in a totally empty, impersonal abstraction. You're like, why is that at the top? Like, couldn't you do it a different way? And in transpersonal psychology, which is kind of the background Ken Wilber comes out of, they were doing that, right? They were taking developmental psychology, which there were a lot of breakthroughs in the early 20th century around people growing up in phases, learning capacities, and then they just stacked famous mystical states on top of that to make transpersonal psychology. So you'd become an adult human, and then you become a subtle, causal, non-dual realizer. Great. That doesn't work really well when you investigate it. And so they changed an integral to a thing called the Wilber-Combs matrix, which like does it orthogonally, right? So you can have all of those spiritual types of experiences at any stage of development. They don't really tell you about that. So you're not in a heroic progress away from the gross realm through the subtle realm to the empty worlds. Those worlds are all sort of cooperating. They're all present all the time. None of them's higher up in a hierarchy. Your best bet is to integrate and work with all of them and not try to escape from the mortal and the finite and the human. And I think the result of that is you stop thinking about the transcendental as impersonal and start thinking about it as hyper-personal. Not hyper-personal in the sense of like, just broadcasting yourself on Instagram or something, but like a more deeply unique and idiosyncratic experience of being is the location of your transcendence, not an escape from the personal.
Oh, that's so interesting. Because I don't normally think of it that way. I do normally think of like these higher states, which I like sort of think of as like we talk a lot about the jhanas and stuff. So you get these like space and consciousness and things like that. And I think of those as more universal, as the things that existed before me and the things that will exist after me and the things that everybody experiences. And like you're saying that I guess when you're going through it, you become like the thing you're looking at is when you're going through it, you're realizing yourself more, and like your unique existence in this earth, which is also there, which don't really tend to talk about, because I feel like it might come across as egotistical, and I'm afraid of getting called out on that kind of stuff.
If we think of like classic oversimplification of developmental progress, whether it's historical, evolutionary, personal, or in terms of ascending jhana states or something like that, very often people go to this notion of like increasing spheres, like the sheer volume of consciousness is increasing.
Yeah.
But if you use a torus instead of a sphere, like the torus folds back into its own center, you can't tell what's going more deeply into the middle and what's expanding out at the edge because it's the same circuit. I think that's a little bit more sophisticated way to do it. Just like if you go, when we made that change to modern time from traditional time, like traditional time has sort of days, and it has maybe 6,000 years that it imagines we've been here for a cycle of a few thousand years. And then we're like, no, I think it's been billions of years. So we had this huge expansion in how we process time, but also a contraction. Like we went down to fractions of a second. Right. And then likewise, when we go to like a more sort of so-called postmodern reality, we'll go, well, there's actually all kinds of other universe pathways out there. Our physics are pointing at multitudes. There's vastness. It's many galaxies. And at the same time, we've got like these nanoseconds now on our clocks. So as the expansiveness increases, the zeroing in increases at the same time. I kind of think that's a better way to think about the movement is it gets bigger and more inclusive and narrower and more precise and nuanced in the same move.
Damn. Damn. I can tell you've done this as a psychotech. Fuck. Yeah. Oh my God.
So I have a puzzle that I've been playing with. I'm just going to lay it on the line and let Layman make some comments. It seems like, well, you're talking about this great expansion externally, this great finitude specifically. I see that like this great expansion externally, like, I guess mentally, I imagine that space is all out there and like it goes boundlessly to infinite. And then internally, I've got this great expansion as I like develop my consciousness to greater complexity and greater expansiveness internally as well. And then somewhere between the two, there's this interface that is like human consciousness trying to have an experience in this moment that is like a really squeezy little bottleneck that I'm trying to squeeze the giant self that is internally out through the bottleneck into the external world that has possibly expansiveness and if I look far enough away. Like, what's going on that there's this like bottleneck puzzle? Like, how am I meant to live around this stupid, shitty bottleneck where everything that I am is the bottleneck? And yet I hate it because it's so tiny. I try to squeeze myself through a bottleneck just to exist.
Yeah, well, that's the existential dilemma, isn't it? You're inhibiting both the expansion and the contraction.
Yeah.
So then there's, a couple of famous ways to go at that. Like speaking very generally, there's the realization and the way, right? There's a whole bunch of a life of practice you can do to build up your capacity to allow that current to move in and out. And a lot of that's going to involve leaning in on purpose to unpleasant sensations that you associate with the contraction. And then there's a realization, which is more common in like Zen and things like that, where there's moments where you can cut the whole mode of thinking around the experience, right? Like, what if there was no difference between going further in and not going further in, right? We can play with that for a moment, but if there was a moment when you're like, holy shit, there's no difference, I guess I already am the thing. So there's those that like, I'm always already complete, the realization, insight patterns. And then there's the still, you got to keep getting better, allowing conductivity to move through you in various ways that seem both positive and negative. And those kind of ideally converge to make something like a path.
How you doing, Daniel? Did I lose you?
Yeah, I'm tripping hard. this Taurus. I don't even know the words you said, but I'm like feeling like the expansion contraction because I used to do like one and then the other, but they're just happening. The Taurus shape, they just happen all at the same time, and then it's just moving.
How does it feel?
It feels really good. Yeah, because I feel like I have a lot of like my like there's like gears in my head kind of, and they don't ratchet always nicely, and this is like a very smooth way of so I don't have to like shift as much
Because they just
I have no idea what's going on. I really like it.
Well, let's chalk that up to divine mystery.
I mean, like, if I wanted to be slightly less mysterious, can you try and guess at what's going on there, Layman? Like, you've talked to enough people, you've worked through enough psychotechs that you could probably put better words to it than just a great mystery. Maybe.
Well, sure. There's a if you are successful in any given moment at generating or accessing a coherence that goes beyond the perceptual and cognitive array of objects, including your mental objects, then that will be a coherent feeling which is unbound by the things that generate conventional knowledge. So in order to actually articulate it or bring it forward, to experience it or communicate it, you have to point to something that's outside the range of normal cognitive objects and their interrelations. You built this extra overtone that's operating outside of the parts. So one way to point at that is it's a mystery, or it's ignorance, or it's confusion, or paradox, or something like that. But I think probably the more objectively technical way would be to describe it as the production of a field of coherence that exceeds the adaptive perceptual and cognitive syntax that you're used to in any given moment.
Yeah. Would you call this like meta paradigmatic, or is this like a level above that in terms of abstraction?
That's really hard, because when you're talking about those kind of levels, it gets really blurry. You know, it's when meta paradigmatic, cross paradigmatic, even paradigmatic, you're already into a kind of hazy area where it involves so few people in the population that ordering that is kind of a put on at best.
Okay.
But certainly it's something that can be applied to a variety of ways of being integrally incorporative, right? There's this project called the Archdisciplinary Society, right? So what they're trying to do is make what they call arches. I'm on that team that go between meta theories. What do integrative meta theories and transdisciplinary models tend to have in common? What's the next more inclusive layer of that? And so one of the things I have a metaphysics that I argument, but also I think what's more important is the practice element. And so I would think this kind of stuff we're discussing is a practice element that describes what happens in all of the meta models. So we could call that meta paradigmatic if we wanted to.
I'm like, okay, if it's practice, how do I get good at this practice?
Yeah. First off, I want to acknowledge this really high level stuff. But yeah, continue with Elliot's.
Like if I want to be exercising, I want to be like,
yeah, like how do we get good at this?
Muscle,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, here's the thing. This is part of my morning exercise routine, right? So I'm going to do a physical exercise. Let's say I'm going to do some planking. So I'm doing my planking. And then how long am I going to? I've got a physical effort, right? And then I'm going to make a mental effort. Let's say I'm going to count. Right? But let's say it's too easy to count by ones. Let's say I'm going to try to count by threes. So I'm going to do my planking, which is a physical effort. I'm going to make a mental effort of counting by threes. And I've decided in advance that I wish to have a particular emotional quality. Maybe it's Christmas and I want to feel Christmas magic.
This is hardcore.
So now I'm planking, I'm counting by threes, and I'm feeling Christmas magic. And of course, I'm aware that they are not perfectly balanced, right? I'm probably putting a little more focus on holding myself in the plank than I am on feeling Christmas magic. But I'm struggling the whole time to try to get those as balanced as I can, so that when I get up from that exercise, I'm not just healthier and more toned in body, I have a generalized sense of multi-systemic beingness. So that's an example.
Yeah, this is something I'm working on.
That's the transcendent experience.
Specifically, the exercise of different layers. Yeah. Right? Like I know what physical exercise looks like, but it's harder to know what mental or emotional exercise looks like.
Yeah. Emotional exercise
Easier
is
than
a really
mental.
important one to consider, because it's not well thought about in our culture, right? We don't, and probably any culture, but we don't really have a conversation around feeling on purpose. There's some of that discussion goes on in Buddhist psychology and different areas. That I don't know if you guys know the Heart Math Institute. What they attempted to do was track the electrical activity going on in the neural tissue in this part of your body and the neural tissue in this part of your body. And what they claimed to find was when the electrical signature syncs up in these two regions as sort of the dominant frequency band, people tend to be in a particular range of emotions. They tend to be in gratitude, appreciation, love, or any other terms they use to describe that general thing. So they have two types of practices. One practice is try to generate those feelings, and they create the synchronization. The other one is you try to create the synchronization to get those feelings. So you could be, I'm watching my emotional reactions, I'm watching my thoughts, I'm watching my emotional, right? And after a while, they probably fall into alignment pretty easy, and you get into like a smooth, coherent state of heart-mind organization. So that's one way to do it. But there's also a lot of opportunity to intentionally alter our emotional states, right? We don't practice that. We don't teach each other to practice that. But if you, this will be stupid, but I led the Metamodern Spirituality Retreat, the second one in the fall, and I sort of walking people through this exercise I call prayer-sturbation, right? So the idea is start with the notion of how you would masturbate on a desert island with no prompts whatsoever. You got no porn, there's no other humans. If you just decided you were going to masturbate, you would have to sort of call up erotic stimuli in your mind, and probably no one of those stimuli would be enough. You'd probably have to move through a sequence of them to try to get a general sense of what they share. And then once you've got that sense, you could deepen and enrich it and amplify it and try to embody it more. And so people are somewhat familiar with that when it comes to their sexual life. And when you think about doing it at any one of the other so-called chakra levels, then you get a sense of how broad this thing could be. So the way I was doing it with prayer-sturbation is we're going to enact these sensations and emotions that go with superlative experience, right? So instead of thinking about a bunch of hot things, I'm thinking about a bunch of things that are positive and maximal, like the ultimate, the absolute, God, the most high, the most merciful, the most transcendental, the light of all lights. You know, you start going through this routine and you're just repeatedly accessing a certain range of thoughts, but each of those thoughts has a little bit of emotion. And if you keep accessing thoughts that have the same kind of emotion, you build up some of that charge, and then you can start to work with that charge directly. So that's, you know, one of the simple ways to think about intentionally activating any particular emotional state. So that's part of the set of intentional emotional psychotechnologies that would, the capacity in that area would feed into doing multi-systemic practice if emotions were going to be part of that practice for you.
So I want to check, like, does your morning routine have like 30 reps of anger, or like, like, ah! Like how does this actually play out? How do you do this?
Well, usually I kind of whimsically think of one, whichever is interesting to me in the term. Anger is interesting, right? Because anger is usually thought of as a negative, but it certainly has a role. Frustration has a role in physical exercise. And there's a very interesting argument that when you bring intentionality into emotion, there really aren't negative emotions anymore. You create some kind of loop between the emotional system.
Right,
and the
because if you
cortex.
intention towards it, then it's not unaversive anymore.
When you're leaning into it, it ceases to have its automatic negative qualities and it starts to restabilize.
Right. And
There's
so
a
you play with
story.
and you play with it.
I don't want to just ramble, but there's a story that Lee Gerdes, he created a system of electronically mediated brain states that he thought was going to be the successor to neurofeedback. They have a very large organization now. But in his book about how he practiced with it, developing sensors and developing a digital interface where you mentally modulate the interface to modulate your internal conditions. He found himself depressed. He was able to move himself into a more equilibrium kind of a state. His son was very depressed. He wanted his son to try it, but he was worried about the possibility of a negative feedback loop. Like, what if he goes in depressed and he starts making himself more depressed? That would be bad. So he wanted to test it. So he tried to put himself into a negative emotional feedback loop. And at first he felt really shitty, and the next day a little bit less shitty, and the next day a little bit less shitty, until he felt really good again. Because when the brain has that feedback wiggle room to modulate its own emotions, it drifts toward the emotions it would like to have, no matter which ones you're practicing. So when you bring consciousness and intentionality into the negative, Trungpa was really good at this. The famous quote, somebody asked him, what do you do if you find yourself in hell? And he said, I try to stay there. Right? You try to be an intentional participant in the negative, and then it starts to lose its negative qualities because it starts to integrate with the rest of the system.
Right. Very powerful. I mean, I was just about to ask this question, right? That every time I go to practice an emotion, like an anger, right? The memories lose their power. And like my resource for doing my reps is like getting the weights are getting lighter. Like, how do you happen to have a trick for like resourcing the experiences you're trying to work with?
Just so that you don't lose touch with your anger?
Well, right. Or like, if I want to work with emotions as a resource or as a dimension of reality, I don't want it to soften and vanish and integrate, right? I want it to still be there. Do I need to start caring about things I didn't used to care about so that I have things to be angry about? Like, how do I?
Well, I mean, the standard scheme is just to be in an intimate relationship.
It isn't actually. Oh, okay. Like, this is the classic Ram Dass quote: "If you think you're enlightened, go spend a week with your family.
Get married and try to fix the plumbing."
Right. You'll find many more instances of new anger.
That's right. There's an endless font of
like, just start living life and you'll find them. Don't worry about it.
Right. Okay. Keep doing reps.
Damn, that is crazy. Like, you've got like all this stuff mapped out in like your meta maps are really good. Good job. Do you have any more meta maps that are interesting that we can learn about?
Just like, I'm like writing out my list of my repertoire, and I'm like, oh yeah, do a couple more anger reps every morning now that with my plank.
Dude, I love these. Like, you're like, you've got like all the dimensions going on. You're like, okay, do this. I feel like it's almost like we could just build like a tarot deck out of this, and then every morning we just like draw a couple cards, and that's the exercise in the morning.
Yeah, I think it would make a good deck.
I mean, is this inspired by like integral life practice, or is this just
it's resonant? It's resonant with integral life practice. Those guys did a pretty good job, although it was preliminary. But I think all of us are in the same position as the authors of that book. We're all trying to chart out how we would stay healthy in all these different domains as best we can and coordinate them as best we can. Now, the thing that book does discuss really is, what do you evoke when you do the coordination really well, right? They have some practices that deal with the transcendental, but they don't really look at the question of whether or not the transcendental is produced or not. It gets back to the basic metaphysical question, but I think it's important going forward to have a model of this that is as agnostic as possible, right? So that if you want to go at it through the idea that there is some manifest external transcendental power, that you can do that just fine, but people who don't want to take that too seriously can have all the same experiences and the same development. Like, we don't need a model that forecloses the situation. We need one that anybody can use.
I'm on board with that. I'm on board with that.
That's a good way to describe that.
I
Because
mean,
I feel like psychotechnology as a term is agnostic to these, but still recognizing the transcendence as well. But as the transcendent as is versus as something else.
Yeah, and I think it's a great term, and I think that's why it's gaining momentum culturally, and we're probably just at the beginning of that. So you've got a well-named podcast.
Thank you. It felt a bit arrogant to like take that name, but
no one else was, and we were like, oh yeah, this is important. There should be someone talking about this, particularly like the threads of different religious cultures, like sort of funneling into psychology, and the threads of different psychologies funneling into like starting to point at the same thing. Like, we're finally coming to a place where psychology is clustering into into like a like mainline thread of like, this is the way to be.
Well, this is, like I mentioned before, so much of this in my mind goes back to Nietzsche, who I don't think is read very well by people, but he's trying to be trans-nihilistic. He's trying to get on the other side of the meaning crisis in the 1800s. And one of the things he says is the last and best discoveries are the methodologies.
Interesting.
Right. So that's those are the psychotechnologies. Like, how do you actually do it?
I mean, I also look at this through like a spiral dynamics lens, right? We don't get to like making ideologies until we get to yellow, which is 7 layers in, like 7 tiers in.
Yeah.
Like we can't build the system until we've been in it for a while, and we're like, oh yeah, that's what I've been doing all this time.
Yeah, the developmental models are interesting to me, because one of the things you can do is, like integral and spiral dynamics do, is we just keep going, right? You get up there to the level at which you're construct aware, and then you can have a participatory role in generating various idea and belief systems. Fantastic. But another way to do it, I call it the coaxial model, is you could think of the second tier as perpendicular to the first tier, because there are a number of things that sort of argue against just going forward endlessly. Right. One of those things is, what do we do about seemingly super integrated ancient peoples? Another one is, how do we handle the fact that when you're going into something like a stage transformation, you go through periods where you feel super integrated, and then you kind of come down from that as the next one stabilizes. You don't lose any of the structure, but you do seem to be less super integrated than you were before. We're indicating that the integration variable might be able to operate independently of the developmental structure variable, which would also go along with ancient peoples being able at certain times to be able to super integrate their stage of development. So it might even be the case that people with richer, more complex stages of development, where they recognize a broader range of patterns of reality, that's harder to integrate than if you only have a few types of reality to integrate.
Yeah.
Right. So the people who built the pyramids, pyramids are fantastic. They're not just awe-inspiring. It's like they brought together all of the math and all of the geometry and all of the astronomy and all of the culture and all the spiritual practices. They brought every genre of their activity together in a single super integrated structure. Fantastic. How would we do that today? Right? Today, you could spend your whole life and not learn 10% of soil science. Right? So there's so much to integrate. So the odds of integrating it all go down as the complexity increases. So there are reasons to think that maybe there was a higher level of developmental integration among people who lived in simple, more natural contexts historically. Not necessarily proven either way, but we can think of those next levels like yellow and teal, turquoise, that kind of stuff, as being perpendicular or as an extension. So I think it's important to have at least a couple versions of any of the meta models on the table, so we don't get locked into any one of them.
I mean, one question I have is, does it keep looking like Zen as we collapse down complexity into like perfect perfect sentences? Like
Yeah.
the I
Like
Ching.
it looks,
Does the I
it looks
Ching
like
keep making
anytime
sense?
you do it really tightly, like super
Right,
pack it down,
right.
then it looks like Zen.
Right.
So I do all this stuff on the metaphysics of adjacency, right? Where like, what is the relationship, the interspace between types of perspectives? So you go, well, pluralism, green, has like, okay, everybody's in their own different reality, man, but they're kind of conflicting or far apart. And integral thinking goes, well, actually, we could pack those a lot tighter. But here's a model where they're all kind of clumped in really nicely. But then Zen is something like, well, let's take a couple of them and just pack them so tight you can barely tell them apart. Like if you go through a koan and you're like, wow, there's exactly as much sameness as difference in this koan, and they're so closely packed to each other, I can't even pull them apart. Right? That's the like the maximal packing. Like how many electrons could you fit in a certain unit of space? There is a maximum packing. And I
How many
think
angels
koans are
can
like
dance
the
on heaven's
semantic
side?
maximum packing of perspectives.
Mm. Or is there like, are we just waiting for the time where we try and fit 37 perspectives into a cone and then we don't, and then we have this like anti-cone or something that's like 2 sentences long and the most horrible thing? Or like, or do they just keep fitting? Do they just keep packing like a black hole? You just keep shoving in and like it just
Well, we're gonna have to ask the AI on that one. I mean, you don't have to go very far before you reach the limit of human ability to compress the complexity.
There's I was reading a psychology book recently and it was like most jokes have 7 or less perspectives. It was like the kid goes to the barber and says, and the barber says, do you want the like this shiny $2 or the like the $5 note? And the kid goes, I'll take the shiny $2 and walks away. And the guy at the barber says, like, to the kid, why would you do that? And the kid says, well, the day I take the $5 note, the game ends and I get $2 every other day. But there's 3 people in this joke and there's multiple perspectives going on. But as soon as you try and add another 5 perspectives, there's not a joke anymore. It's just stressful and people can't keep track.
Yeah.
Like that's human perspectival limit.
Well, I would say people that don't practice the perspectives,
Right.
right? Like I think you can probably like exercise your ability to do perspectives, and then those jokes become like you expand the spaciousness, and the jokes can become even funnier.
Mm.
You have to like work hard to
Yeah.
appreciate
Well,
that.
up to a certain limit, right? Like if you can have people have 2 or 3, people track 4 or 5. Maybe some people work really hard, they get good at tracking 7 or 8, but nobody's doing 50.
Right.
Right. I think there's probably a hardware limit at some point.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Just to go back, you talked about like it seems like you're talking about like a horizontal development versus like vertical development, where the like vertical would be much more integration, and then horizontal is much more broad in the amount of things that you're able to like access or deal with or whatever. And like I do think that there is this trade-off of horizontals for vertical. Like the more things that I'm like, the bigger my life is, like the more things that are in it, the harder it is to optimize or to like integrate into one way. Do you have like, is there like an ideal relationship between these two? Like, or like how do you
I wouldn't
sort of
be shocked if there was a mathematical optimization. I don't know it. I think everybody is coming out of their own background, their own neurogenetic structure, their own, subtle signature. You got to work on what you're confronted with and what's outstanding and causing you problems and what you're in love with. So that's going to tell
say
you
that
the
again?
few areas you want to focus on.
Sorry, say that again. So the stuff that you're
Pleasure and
confronting with.
pain.
Yeah, like you can't I mean, there may be a way to optimize it, right? It may be that 10 years from now the AI says here's the exact balance of how to do that, but you actually have a limited amount of time and cognitive space to try to integrate some domains of your experience. You're going to be able to pull some parts together and make a surplus or hybridization out of those in some way that's meaningful. So where are you going to work? You're going to work on what you're confronted by in your life, You're going to work on things that are outstanding problems that seem like holes in your system you're not very good at, and you're going to work on things you're awesome at and really in love with. And so that kind of practical steering through life is going to determine where you put your effort in terms of integration. And I think that's all we can really do unless or until supercomputer says, no, here's exactly how to do it. Okay, maybe that's coming, but we're not there yet.
I like that. That's like that feels like a very like life lesson in a simple way everyone can understand. Like you got technical debt, you got things that are happening, and then you got the things that you're good at that you really want to do.
I mean, you've also got your lifetime. So you call it technical debt, but like your own damn childhood, like your own damn origin story, like your multi-generational whatever's. Like start working on that.
And maybe that changes, right? If I had 300 years,
Right.
I would make different behavioral investments than if I assume I have 90.
Yeah, I would definitely. I mean, the cultural change that might happen with the 300-year lifespan, like great grandma is still alive, but also you don't have to see her once a year because she's got 300 years as well. Like you maybe see her every 3 years and still like appreciate her without being too annoyed about her nagging you about whatever.
Well, that's interesting too, because I think there's a real open question we're all just starting to face around what does intergenerationality look like in these kinds of communities, right? We know that in modern society, we're not very good at getting old, middle-aged, and young people together to exchange wisdom. As a result, we have a wisdom deficit because a lot of that has to do with healthy kids and healthy old people talking to each other.
They all went into nursing homes, that older generation.
And so if we're going to be invested in developmental or meta-aware communities or any of this kind of stuff, what does that look like over a couple of generations? How do we get the older people to function like elders? How do we recognize them as elders? What do we do to make sure that in the future we are the elders we want there to be? I think this is a really important inquiry, and one of many inquiries that are framed around starting to think of ourselves a little bit more shamanic and tribal than we've thought about for a while. But it's really necessary. There's a lot of impressive people right now who have this kind of discourse, have a real life of spiritual practice. They've done a lot of interesting things. They're going to be dead in 10 years. How do we make sure the community is infused with them optimally before they're gone? And how do we navigate our own lives based on that?
Yeah, tell us more about this. This is something I'm trying to figure out as well. I'm like thinking of this as like on a clan dimension and like a tribe dimension, where there's like my family and then like my immediate and then like close family, where like I'm gonna have grandchildren. I want to hopefully one day, and I'll want to set that up so that they're looking to me for that wisdom, but also I'm having the wisdom. And also that relationship is a wise relationship. It's not me just saying, hey, you have to sit here and listen to me lecture at you, which is sort of like the wisdom tradition that I came from. It's a lot of lecturing. And
it's a mixture of different zones, right? Like you're saying, there's a lot of traditions where you just get the lecture, and we have to use those intelligently, but also kind of co-opt them a little bit to be more open and more human. There are the meta communities. We need to get them to function a little bit more like actual human tribes. And then there are the families and situations that we're in, because our own families and our own reproduction, that's going to be our frontline ability to make contact with the wisdom of our elders and to impart wisdom going forward, which is partly having the attitude of going to our elders and respecting them like elders, even if they say a bunch of horse shit sometimes. And at the same time, relating to our children, relating to the like basic form of developmental learning, which is what children do really well, relating to that in a way that makes them have a good attitude about the viewpoint we're bringing forward as they age, rather than just thinking of us as some kind of weird age-based role that they have to work around.
Right. I mean, I'm just like
hard truths.
I've been sitting here in my head, and this memory that I've been spent the last couple of weeks kind of processing it, was like when it came time to try and explain to grandma what Google was. Like and this is maybe when I was 10 or 15, she could email, or she eventually learned to email, and she emailed her relatives overseas and the cousins that were in other cities, but she never even learned Google. She was like, we have the world's most powerful ask it a question engine, and she never even learned that there was such a thing, because we went, this is too hard to explain to you, grandma, we're just not gonna.
Yeah, and like, how do you deal with elders? Is like, part of it is you accept them, right? Like, they're not going to meet your standard. They're going to be like, there's a whole bunch of shit they don't care about. And that's part of their wisdom. But not every older person is an elder, so we have to be able to make that distinction. Some of them are just old. But then there are things you're like, what would you look for? What are you looking for? What are we looking for in an elder? Like, I'll tell you, my personal one was, even though my parents are awesome, I think of them both as elders. The first time I ever thought that's an elder is when I met Tim Leary as a kid. I got to, he came up, my dad got me tickets, got to go backstage with him, but this was an old guy to me. I was 19, something like that. His eyes were shiny. He was dancing around. He was all about cyber culture. He was going off about the drugs he took and how they're related to different spiritual traditions. And he was just so full of some shininess that was keeping up with new things in his own way, using his own parameters. I thought, holy shit, that's what an old person could be like. I don't have to agree with them, but that is what an old person should look like.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Like, that's amazing. Like, it's like, yeah, like, I feel like, oh my God. Yeah. Like, you're really embodying that. Like, I feel like there is, like, to become old and do that, you have to do that when you're young and like keep doing that. Yeah. And then just don't stop doing it. And then you're still doing that when you're old. Yeah.
You keep doing it the whole time. And if you can honor the older people who are doing it, your odds of doing it throughout your life go up, and your odds of being useful to younger people go up.
Right.
Part of the way that memory sits with me is I'm like, wait a second. I don't want my grandkids to be all like, let's not explain to grandpa this guy what Google is because it's too hard, because he's just an old fuddy duddy, right? I don't want that to happen. I actually want the relationship that makes possible them to explain the Google to me, because I would love to know about Google if there was no Google and now I get to know it. Like, I want to know that.
Then you got to cultivate from day one a communication pathway with them, where they can inform you about what's going on in them and in the culture, but where you don't sacrifice any of the needed authority that's necessary in parenting. Right. And then that's going to be changing as you go.
This is like, better start cleaning up soon. Otherwise, your crap is going to be like, don't tell me about the stupid Google thing. And you're going to be like, they don't tell me things anymore. Why am I locked in a nursing home? This isn't very fun.
It's hitting too close to home.
And then again, that's where the intimate relationship, right? That's where your significant other comes in, and they can be like, hey, you're starting to sound like your dad or whatever. Point out where you're entrenched. And if you're interested in continuing, then you're interested in that critique, because it's easy to just be offended by that shit, especially when they got their problems too. But you're like, I actually want to keep changing. So please give me that feedback, because I want to evade the lockdowns that are natural to human beings as they age.
I mean, I think I do kind of believe in this one, but I think I can sell relationship as a developmental tool. like your relationship, your being in a relationship is about your development, you growing up, you becoming a better person. Don't worry about the other person. It's about you. It's about you finding your own craft.
At some point, it might be time to deal with their shit, but up front, take as much as you can. And then there's one of the things that's involved, and I touched on it earlier, is this ability to lean into negative seeming emotional states, right? There's two kinds of emotional states we're not good at: ecstasy and misery. We're terrible at both of those, right? It's really hard for people to be joyous and happy and ecstatic and satisfied. It's also really difficult for them to be frustrated, unhappy, depressed. It's just a problem they immediately try to deal with until it goes away, rather than going, oh, this is interesting. What if I lean into it a little bit more? What if I tried to feel this shitty on purpose, not just accidentally? So both of those ranges are important, but particularly that negative one. So much of what we do as humans is defending ourselves against that, when that opens us up to ongoing developmental possibilities.
This is a question I have as well. So as I have done a bunch of development work and like built systems and structures, I have done the thing where I've moved further away from negative experience. I'm in my intellectual castle where no one can properly insult me because they can't find where I am, because you can't hit me because I'm this ethereal being which dodges insults in every way, shape. But now I'm like safely away from insults and not growing anymore. I'm like, oh shit, I developed in the wrong, like I grew up in the and somehow went in the non-growing up direction. I went in the like too well guarded direction. Oh no. Is this like inherent to develop?
There is a problem there, right? Like as you grow, the subtlety of the suffering you have to have your eye out for gets more precise, more refined. So you got to be more on guard to find it. There are ways to amplify that effect, which is getting more involved in stuff, right? Doing activities you're not good at, dealing with types of people you don't normally associate with or like. There are ways to find more of that provocation in yourself.
Or like you're expanding horizontally. Now the vertical integration is harder.
Yeah.
And as you do the vertical integration, you can expand farther as well. Like
is this built into development that you develop and then you're like, oh, I'm all like safe in here, and then you need to like go into that uncomfortable territory again, and then you need to make that safe and then grow up again? And
if you are extremely lucky and privileged, then yes,
you get some safety along the way. Like, otherwise you don't.
For most human beings, some horrible shit comes at them.
Yeah, I'm like, do I want to wait for the horrible
really shit going wrong in your world? Then yeah, you get to suffer in that fashion.
You get to choose your own suffering. This is the reward for like being highly developed.
Being on the ball and getting ahead of the bell curve on like your own growth. Yeah. You get to suffer in this particular fashion.
Yeah. You also get, now here's an interesting feature of it, right? Empathic distress. It's one of these terms they use in thinking about childhood moral and ethical development. Is you're supposed to sort of sting kids a little bit when they hurt someone else, so that they can think about that distress as being connected to their distress. Right. But as we develop and take on perspectives, and as we have more of a, let's say, universal experience of what it's like to be human, our possibility to experience the distress of others goes up. Now, Ken Wilber has this phrase, hurts more, bothers you less, right? So that if you're more willing to take on some aspect of other people's suffering. And we see this in the Christ character. We see this in the Buddha story. We see this in a variety of ways, right? And so as you grow and feel more comfortable, more secured in the invincible fortress of your realization and growth
that protects people from harming me, yeah.
Right. You also have less motive to defend yourself against the misery that's presented in movies or other people's lives. Now, you might want to pragmatically avoid it, right? You can't take on the karmic burden of everybody else all the time. But as you are more stabilized in yourself, you have less motive to defend yourself against the unhappiness of others. And there is an ocean of that out there.
Yeah. This is complicated because I'm like, maybe like some days I'm like, I'll take a bit more. And then other days I'm like, whoa, I need to catch up. Like it's a real dance that I find myself in.
It's a tough thing. There's a guy, Tom Habib, he's a psychologist, and he was trying to do an assessment in integral type communities to see whether there was a higher percentage of highly sensitive persons or not. Mm-hmm. And so I was helping him work through the initial testing procedure, which they presented at the Integral European Conference. And one of the questions was, do you find yourself bothered by the entertainment that you're watching? And I had just been like weeping at some ridiculous not even sad show, but it didn't bother me. So I was like, how do I answer this question? No, it didn't bother me. I mean, it broke my heart and I shook on the couch for a few minutes, but it didn't really bother me.
I cry every time, like when I watch Naruto, I'm always crying.
Exactly.
That is I mean, as someone recently suggested to me, after a certain point, the ability to have a breakdown in front of others is actually a skill.
Yeah.
Like if you can let yourself fall apart vulnerably in front of other people, that's actually really difficult to do for most people who can't get vulnerable.
If you watch reality TV shows, and there's a variety of quality in that, but there's a lot of interpersonal social competition going on. And one of the interesting things I've noticed is people tend to do a little bit better after they cry. It's usually one of the female characters, and they feel embarrassed that they're having an emotional expression. They go aside and everything's terrible. And in like the next round, suddenly they're together because they process through that emotion.
Right.
So like good advice would be break down in front of other people earlier so that you have the rest of the game, right? You don't want to break down in front of other people at the end. The breakdown might be putting you in your optimal form by going through that processing. So build up that strength, the ability to break down in front of other people. And one of the main other people is yourself.
Well, I'm just back at that confusion where like building my developmental growth was about not having to break down anymore. Like what how is it that like I wanted to like build up a strength, but actually the breakdown is also, post-traumatic growth by Casimir, I forget his name, Dobrov, whatever, psychologist, post-traumatic growth, and yet I have less breakdowns than ever. I think
if you're drowning, then you desperately want to get out of the water onto the dock, right? But if you feel stabilized on the dock, now you're thinking maybe you're going to go for a swim.
Right. But like,
yeah, it's that choice again.
Should I go drown again? Like, wait a second. I'm not an idiot. I don't need to go drown again. And yet,
but you can go back in the water and swim. Like you don't have to drown every time. Like you're only drowning because you didn't know how.
But the drowning is where I learned the most stuff.
Yeah. Well, this is a great
practice swimming.
We were talking about the way that intentionality plays into negative emotion. You hear this in like Jordan Peterson riffs all the time. Is his description of exposure therapy is that it only works when you do it on purpose, right? If you're traumatized by spiders and somebody throws spiders at you, that's not going to help. If you're traumatized by spiders and you agree to look at a spider for a while, that's going to fucking help, but only because you volunteered for it. Then it's a different process.
Right. So if I feel like going swimming again, that's a good sign.
Yes.
But if I don't rush it. There's no need to rush.
Don't rush it. But I am looking forward to your emotional breakdown.
Hopefully we'll catch it live on
the Psychotechnology
channel.
I too have, I don't know what angle it will come from, but I'm sure it will come from somewhere. This is and like as a psychotech, have a breakdown seems like terrible advice. And yet I'm like, how do I tell people that the terrible advice is actually the good advice? The like, go have a breakdown is super important for your growth, your learning, and your development. Like, how am I meant to, like, as psychotechnologists, how am I meant to advocate for have more breakdowns?
So Greg Henriquez, who has the universal theory of knowledge now, he tried to unify psychology. He's got a model that's kind of roughly consonant with Wilber's model, works with Vervaeke a lot. He talks about this thing he calls the triple negative neurotic loop, which he thinks characterizes neurosis, right? It's triple negative. So bad shit happens to you. You feel bad about feeling bad, and that locks it in. Right. So you've got these three negatives that lock into each other and become neurotic. So legitimately bad things happen. You legitimately felt bad. You feel bad about feeling bad. And so you stop feeling bad. You've locked it in. It can't get out.
Right.
So the first therapeutic thing to do to untie that knot is let yourself feel the bad feelings. Then at least you're down to 2 from 3.
Yeah, we used to at Think Better retreats, we would say we're meta okay. So
Yeah.
like something happens, you're not okay, but you're meta okay, like you're recognizing.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it.
I have another thread that's coming through with this, and I think of it as a crazy wisdom kind of idea. So the Eric, what was his name? Games people play. Eric Byrne had this basic model of parent, adult, child, and someone can act more and play a game. Someone can act more like a child to make you more like the parent and have the parental relational thing to them. And what you really want to do is have like parent-parent relationships. And that's like the healthy thing, right? We all just want to be like adult relationships with everyone, right? We don't have to be better than everyone else. We don't have to be parent. We don't have to be child. We're both like playing stupid games. We want to be adult, right? This is cool. And I like this as a like basic psychology theory. I have the crazy wisdom version stacked on top of that as be more of a child and then like be more transformative. But this is like dangerous advice, and I'm like, how many people should I give this advice to? Like, do I pick highly developed, highly reflective people and encourage them to be more of a child and more of a parent and more of a like the other ones so that they can encourage other people to see how to be an adult? Or do I just not tell everyone, keep my mouth shut and like play with it gently on my own? Like, where's the place for crazy wisdom?
Well, you want to explore it pretty thoroughly on your own before you start advising anybody.
I mean, the same applies for like just this basic method of like head towards the emotion and then it softens. Like head towards depression, it softens. You can apply the same thing to like head towards the narcissism, and it'll soften and transform. Like
it's so context dependent. Like, how do you help somebody with their physical health? Right? You might go, well, you're suffering a lot of inflammation. I think you should make these dietary changes. But that's terrible advice if they're currently hemorrhaging blood.
Right.
Like it's very different context in terms of everybody's going to show up to you from a different spot. And if somebody's going through something, then you got to help them go through it and then suggest to them that they make some intentional participatory effort to do something that counterbalances that. If somebody's already very stable and secure, then you might want to say to them, hey, here's some ways you could play with being insecure on purpose and try to, expand the terrain that you're able to order.
Great. Very, very context dependent wisdom.
Let's talk about the meta. You mentioned before the meta communities having like these tiers of wisdom with like the like within the family and within the relational and then within the meta community as well. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening or what you're seeing, where you're going?
Yeah, we did an interesting thing at the last Metamodern Spirituality retreat where I tried to put types of people on stage. I'm like, let's get the 3 oldest people here up on stage, right? They're of us, so we can trust them. But let's hear if there's any particular perspective they have to offer. And let's have them challenge themselves by thinking, hey, we're actually the oldest people here, which is sometimes tough for them because one of the things that makes somebody be the kind of person we would all think is an elder is that they continue to be fresh and evolving and insightful and youthful their whole time. So it doesn't necessarily strike them right away that they are the elders. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of learning procedure to be the elders, and just like there's a learning procedure to relate to the elders. But we have people who have done lifetimes of work. They're running organizations, right? Maybe they've made some money. Maybe they've made a name for themselves. Maybe they're just super good at their meditation, whatever it is. They need to be thinking about how they pass that on. Maybe they've got 30 more years. Maybe they've got 3 more years. We don't know. Right. So they need to be understanding themselves as transmitters of the wisdom that they've achieved so far. And people who are looking to them have to help them feel comfortable about that. And we have to establish a conversation where we can all start to feel better about the different subdivisions of humans that are normal in tribes, right? Sometimes we're going to be masculine, sometimes we're going to be feminine, sometimes we're going to be old, sometimes we're going to be young, sometimes we're going to be sages, sometimes we're going to be hunters, all that kind of stuff. That kind of diversity has to be normal. And we have to be thinking about kind of like an ethics or an ethos of how do we relate to each other across those distinctions? How do we encourage that transmission? How do we encourage things to be passed on? Because a lot of, there's this sense of, okay, you've got theories and you've got people and you've got projects and you've got the world crisis. So all of that together creates a bunch of overlapping communities who are all vaguely interested in multidimensional transformation of self and society, moving toward a planetary wisdom civilization, not getting destroyed by the meta crisis. Great. How does that go to its next step? Right. One of the solutions is let's get everybody together and try to do intersubjective dialogue, and let's see if we can name the field and say what we are. That's useful. You've also got to make everybody just as developed as they can. You've also got to make them as resourced as possible. You've also got to make them as clean from their own shadow as possible. And then you've got to get them working together, not just on projects, which are essential, but as a kind of clan or tribe, which is the organic way for humans to function together. So like all of that, what is the next step in moving this thing forward? It might be something like tribalization of the field, so to speak. But we don't want to fall into the pitfalls of just regressing to primitive modes of social.
I was going to jump on
right?
that side of that.
There's a pre-trans tribe thing we got to distinguish here.
So how do you the thing that popped in my head was like, okay, now you got to get these guys, their kids need to marry each other so that they're same.
So that they could be the one true tribe of exclusive.
But yeah, how do you deal with the shadow side of tribes? Because as soon as you create an in-group, now there's an out-group. And I feel like, at least when I was growing up, there was a lot of that pushback of out-group, in-group, out-group is the worst thing ever.
Yeah. Well, you got to start with some pretty good people, right? That's one of the basic things. And now there's an in-group, out-group thing there, right? You got to vet people and say, who is actually pretty good at walking the walk of being inclusive and integrative? Who's not secretly smuggling in-group, out-group shit very much? And you take those people and they're going to be the in-group. Right. So that's kind of where you start, because you need some raw material to begin with. But then you've got to say, how do we feel good about the different sub-tribes in our field? Which is to say about the different moods and temperaments. Like some people, because I'm involved with metamodernism, people sometimes go, what's the difference between integral and metamodernism? And I'll be like, integral is generalized psycho-spiritual metamodernism. And metamodernism is like socio-political narrow integralism. You'd find them relative to each other because it's a win-win. But everybody's got a different specialization. People who are really interested in the ideological critique of the dominant system and how we move that forward politically, those often feel different than the people who are like, I just want to go to the monastery and deepen this shit as much as I can, right? Some people are very humorous. Some people are very serious, right? I don't show up the way Daniel Schmachtenberger shows up. I like him a lot, right? But we just have different moods and styles, and everybody across the scene have different moods and styles. There's tension between the Americans and the Europeans in terms of how we handle Hegel and Lacan and psychoanalysis and darkness and art and all this shit, right? So understanding these different thematic zones and personality types and having a good attitude about that is one of the building blocks, right? And one way to say that is to be more imperialistic. If you were running an empire, if you were Caesar, you run into some jugglers, you just think, what do I need jugglers for? You run into some assassins. What do I need assassins for? Gauls. What can I do with Gauls? Italians. What can I do with Italians? Like, you make this inclusive and cooperative presumption, right? That even if it's a thematic type that's different than me, that doesn't matter. The question is, how can they be of service to the cause?
That's very colonial of you.
Yeah, I'm taking it back.
So I got a puzzle. And this one, oh man, this one has been with me for 7 years at least, probably 8 years now, because I found it when I was in a room full of cool people, right? I was like, I ran a weekend retreat. It was awesome. It was a room full of cool people. And I was like, that was awesome. I had a room full of cool people. I just want to be more in a room of cool people. Do I like, oh no, sudden crisis? Do I drop everything I'm doing, go over to wherever in the world I think they are and hang out there? Or do I not do that and stay where I am and work on like training up the people around me until they're like they've grown up and then I have a room full of cool people here? Like, which one do I do? My only answer was a bit of both. Like reject some people, pull some people in, have an awesome room, and then like train up these as much as I can, and like occasionally go visit the other rooms. But I don't actually have a good answer for like, should I just let anyone in and include them all and hope that they cohere, or should I fight really hard to build walls around my garden, or should I not? Like, do you have a solution to, like, obviously, like if I think of Integral, it has the alien people sort of hanging out, the conspiratorial people hanging out with, the highly scientific, highly meditative. They're all like this big melting pot of just somehow magically getting along. But should they be? Should there be walls somewhere?
Well, there need to be walls, but there also need to be a lot more, let's say, diplomats than we have right now, right? People who are comfortable moving among them. We need bees have to go to all these flowers to make the pollen or to make the honey or whatever it is, right? So we have some people are going to have to specialize, and some people have a temperament that makes it really easy for them to specialize.
Peter Limber calls that mimetic mediation.
Yeah, exactly. Right. He's a great example of it. Right. There need to be, let's say you got a body and then you got a brain cells. Right. There's all the cells, all the organs have their jobs to do, and they don't have to do any of the other jobs, even if these are organs in the body of super integrative people. And then there are the facilitator organs, and they have to get better at moving between these different contexts, at uniting and organizing the other ones, at sharing the information. And they have to get together with each other and try to work out what the skill set and mood and orientation of those cells is going to be. Right? So I see some of that forming. I see what I might call like enclaves or subnetworks of integrative facilitators trying to get together, trying to say, what is it that makes us different? And then how can we be of service to the extended body? A lot of it depends on your specific circumstance, though, right? If you find yourself totally obsessed only with making second-tier economic models, and you're really uncomfortable with people, yeah, you got to work on being uncomfortable, but you focus on your thing. Right? If you're the kind of person who goes, actually, I think I probably could move between a bunch of these, and the borders are open, and I have the money to get on a plane, and I know where to go. If that happens to be your specific circumstance, then maybe that's something to take advantage of.
That's really nice. It's like very, like everybody has what to contribute, and like everybody's specialized, everybody's generalized. We talked before about the seeds of the people, they're like the inclusive. Can you talk more about like what do you think like the description of the people that you would want there to be, like the nucleus or the seed of the group that's like would form around them?
Yeah, who are the shamanic facilitators of the overlapping meta communities?
Yeah, I mean names are cool if you want, but also like qualities or what things you're looking for.
Yeah, I think we're looking for people who are, they're very open, like high on trait openness in psychology. They're the kind of people who have a sense of how you would be an artist or a performer, like they've got that kind of energy. They're good with subtle sensation. They're good with energy. They're very focused on intersubjectivity. They might have been like super sensitive or super empathic when they were younger and figured out some way for that to not destroy them, even though it might have been close at times. They're probably good at taking altered states. They're probably really good at steel manning arguments. And they probably, I mean, what they don't know is what it's like to get together with other people that have that specific signature. And I think that's where a lot of the work in the next couple of years is going to be, is for those people to get together, realize that there's a difference, sink into being comfortable with the other people who are like that, figure out what the variations are within that. And that's going to take time, because you meet somebody who gets you, you don't just believe it. It's going to take a number of interactions for that to really sink in. Right. And then how do those people support and resource each other and start to move as a team? So I'm seeing little enclaves where people are facing that question together. But I think we're looking at people who are verbally dexterous, emotionally flexible, really empathic, but able to keep that empathy from happening automatically. People who are very focused on something that looks like intersubjective energy transfer as well, and who are intellectually nimble enough to be able to read themselves into whatever pocket or enclave they're dealing with.
It's a really nice list. I want to hang out with those people too.
Okay. Well, there's some in Toronto, man.
Yeah, we should connect. Figure out.
I would have them on here.
There's some in Australia too.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to meet them as well. I mean, I have my local groups, but I also know there are people who are just hiding. They're just in the woodwork somewhere, and I need to like tap on all the things until I find them. Be like, where have you been hiding? Like,
they're probably all in that same situation, right? They're all at this. They're all a little hub for a number of people wondering who else is out there.
I mean, maybe that's that's what this is. This is me ringing a loud bell. I'm here, guys. Come find me. I'm right here. I've been here this whole time.
I feel like that's
gotta become a public speaker. Like,
I feel like that's a lot of like the drive of the channel, is just to like, here's a really loud flare and a flag, and like everybody just like show up here for a little bit at least, and then you gotta like get that lay of the land, get to see who else is around.
Have you guys had Joe Lightfoot on?
No, but we definitely should.
You definitely should. He's in Australia. He's definitely one of these people I'm talking about, and he'd probably do it.
All right, I will get in touch. This is the amazing thing about the Integral Network. I can be like, hey, another Integral person pointed me in your direction. And they go like, come stay at my house and like hang out. I would do.
It's really crazy. And the podcasting thing is such an amazing opportunity. Like right now, you can pretty much have a conversation with anybody on earth, right? Who knows how long that window is going to be open, but I talk to people on my channel, and they're people I was reading their books when I was a kid. And now they're on my podcast talking to me like a peer. I'm like, holy shit, what is this?
That's amazing.
That's where I'd like to go. I'd like to bring more people. I mean, like, I read about 50 books a year. Like, I want to bring them all on mostly.
Yeah.
What a place to be. I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking this might be a good time to like wind up. It's been incredible chatting to you. Much as I don't want it to end, this has been great fun.
Yeah, well,
do we have to like book you in?
I'm having fun, so I come back anytime, you guys.
Oh, okay. Great.
And, what does winding down look like?
We don't have a psychotech for that yet. Do you have any good ones that we could steal and copy? I guess there's like, for me, like always like in the meditation is like after you've done a thing, there's this like after effect.
Yeah.
And then like socially, like when you're about to leave somewhere, there's also like this other thing that happens, like this like second burst of energy or something. So it'd be interesting to explore that. Like, I don't know how though. I would say like, is there anything like coming up for you guys as we're moving to leave?
Well, a question that always stands out for me is how do you assimilate? How do you integrate the experiences you've been through? Like whether it's social or meditative or peak experience or drug experience or whatever, we can go through a lot of shit and then it's just gone. It was just an interesting experience we had. It doesn't become a part of us. So we want it to become a part of us. We want to walk away with some of the energy, not just a memory that we had energy. So I think That question is answered for me partly by somatics, like how's this feeling in our bodies? Can we be a conscious participant in that? Can we take some of that away with us? Can we actually spend some time after this thinking about what we liked, what we didn't like, something that stood out to us? Can we talk about it to other people? Can we take it out in nature? Like, what are our strategies for taking whatever this was and making a percentage of it become our possession going forward, rather than just another thing down the river?
I think I'm about to like sit still for an hour or two and be like, what did I just, what? Just lie around. It's my new psychotech. It's called lying around. It's like, what about that? Like, yeah, what about that? Gonna be a lot of that coming up. I'm not sure. That's my one question with that. Is it a head thing? Am I like missing the rest of the heart and body thing if I'm just lying around thinking about it? Or is that exactly what I need to do?
Well, if you've got it in your head that you should check your heart and body, then you should be okay.
Fair enough.
Step in the right direction.
All right, Dan.
Yeah, endings are a little bit suspect. I was at a retreat recently. It was one of the best I've ever been at in terms of the quality of the people and the energy. The only part I didn't like was the closing ceremonies, because everybody gets a little bit precious and they want to, use that last few minutes to, everybody has their say about how they love everyone here and how great it was. And suddenly nobody's really being open. They're being very performative. They're trying to do their wrap up thing. And it's a little bit obnoxious. You can relate to it. You want to appreciate people. You want them to have the space to communicate in those final moments. But at the same time, it loses some of the spontaneity and the energy that was what made the event worthwhile in the first place.
Got to start with the ending ceremony and then get the whole thing to justifies it.
What I do on the podcast is there's a thing from Lacanian psychotherapy where Lacan would, if he heard an interesting thing from a patient, he would end the session no matter how far into the session they were. So you had to like go home and think about it for a week. So sometimes on my podcast, what I'll do is if I hear an interesting thing and I'm somewhere near the end of the show, I'll just cut it right there. I just stop the recording, because I don't want to necessarily bring the plane down by saying, oh, it was so nice to have you here and I'm looking forward to the next time, which is all true. But maybe we want to just like cut it somewhere on some weird statement and have that ring in the air.
Yeah, I used to do that when I was running like circling sessions. We would do I wouldn't really do closing. We just do okay, now you're all open. Now you're just going to go live life with other people instead of with us. And that's just some people find it a little disconcerting because they want to they open up their empathy and then they want to close it again so they can go back to the world. But I was using it to sort of open and expand my sense of the world.
I'm kind of on the note of is integration even a thing, or is it just you're already integrated? Hit the button. That's it. Maybe we just the experience was the integration. You get what you get.
Although that's pretty convenient.
Very sneaky. Yeah. I don't need to integrate. I'm already integrated.
All right. So what I'm getting is no closing ceremony. We're just gonna all at once. We're just gonna go psychotechnology.